Bill here with the Metals Minute. Today is Wednesday, February 9th, 2022. Well, we have the inflation picture back on tap. We have a big announcement that's due tomorrow, but we thought we'd try to give you a preview. Our latest sources are saying that it should be in the range of 7.3% for inflation, and that will be the highest, they say, in a generation. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that's the official rate, and the official story is it's the highest in 40 years. But when we talked to John Williams of shadowstats.com, and he's the guy that has taken the inflation calculations back to when they were calculated in the 70s and before 1980, and he has taken note of all the changes they've made to how they calculate the inflation rate, and he runs a site that shows what the rate would be if they still calculated it the same way as they did back then. And that's when the reported inflation rate was pretty close to the actual inflation rate. That the rate that they announced publicly is the rate that people were experiencing in real life. And so when we look at his numbers and what he has calculated as the current rate, it's a little over double, right at double what the reported rate is. And instead of the highest inflation in 40 years, it's the highest in approximately 75 years. So that's a different situation. That's a whole nother ball game that we have to prepare ourselves for. And so what do? Well, thankfully, he also notes that the price of gold follows the actual inflation rate, not the official one. So no matter what happens to inflation, no matter how much they underreport it, over time, gold has kept up with the actual inflation rate. There's a good graph on his webpage, shadowstats.com, and he talks about all these inflation parameters and what goes into the calculations and why they're different. There's also another site another index called the Chapwood Index, and there's a website for that as well. And that's a totally different way of calculating inflation. And what they do is they take the 500 most purchased items and they survey major cities across the United States, how much those items have gone up. And so it varies a little bit from city to city, but they're seeing a similar result for inflation. They're a little bit under the shadow stats number on an average, but they're up over 12 to 13%. So that's a similar range using real world items. So thankfully, gold can help us in that regard, and silver as well. Now sometimes people say, well, the stock market does that as well. Yes, sometimes it does. But when we hit periods of stagflation, it's generally not a good time for the stock market. And back, you might remember, or maybe you don't remember, but you can certainly read about what happened in between 1972 and the end of 1974. There were a couple years there where the stock market went down around 30% a year for a couple years, and some areas of the market much more. And that's because stagflation is not a good environment, typically, for stocks. So we've got other news coming out. The House just passed a temporary spending bill because the government would shut down next week if they don't do something. So hopefully that will all get through the Senate and the President's desk without all the drama that sometimes we have. I don't like how they do the budgets. But it's really not. There's not a lot you or I can do about it at this point, other than We just pray that they get something worked out and keep things moving along, and hopefully we'll get people in there that will take proactive steps to be fiscally responsible. Unfortunately, that hasn't, we've got to have somehow vote people of character in there. Just one party versus the other hasn't seemed to solve that issue. Everybody talks about the budget when they're not in power, and then when they're in power, they still spend like that. And so it causes, that's part of why we have the inflation we do, and all the money creation and whatnot. But in any regard, we sometimes have to protect ourselves, and we can do that, thankfully, with precious metals. Thanks a lot. We'll see you soon.